Nope. There you go, you did it, yeah.
Well, I was going to do it on mine, but now I have to do it on that. So Greg will have to come up here and get it off there after I do that. Okay. Now, drink over here so I don't knock it over. What an interesting title for the lesson. I'd forgotten the title, Jamin. When you read that, I thought, are you talking about us? What are these women doing in a place like this? In some ways, this lesson feels like a continuation of this past Sunday's sermon, because from the beginning of the story of Jesus, including today, this day and time even, followers of the risen Messiah and their institutions, that is the institutional church, have struggled with the human and the egocentrical desire to be gatekeepers. They're always gatekeepers. Instead of vessels of overflowing grace, which is what we're invited to be. And comparison and competition are our individual and institutional cancers that kill our capacity to be a healthy community. I want to read the genealogy in Matthew because that's what this whole lesson has been based on. And since we're not studying a particular of the women this time, I just want to read the whole genealogy one more time from the first. I'll go ahead and read the first 17 verses of chapter 1 of Matthew. Matthew says, an account of the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, and Judah the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar, woman number one, and Perez the father of Hezron, and Hezron the father of Aram, and Aram the father of Amminadab, and Amminadab the father of Nahshon, and Nahshon the father of Salmon, and Salmon the father of Boaz by Rahab, and Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of King David. And David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah, and Solomon the father of Rehoboam, and Rehoboam the father of Abijah, and Abijah the father of Asaph, and Asaph the father of Jehoshaphat, and Jehoshaphat the father of Joram, and Joram the father of Uzziah, and Uzziah the father of Jotham, Jotham the father of Ahaz, and Ahaz the father of Hezekiah, and Hezekiah the father of Manasseh, and Manasseh the father of Amos, and Amos the father of Josiah, and Josiah the father of Jeconiah and his brothers at the time of the deportation to Babylon. And after the deportation to Babylon, Jeconiah was the father of Salathiel, and Salathiel the father of Zerubbabel, and Zerubbabel the father of Abiud, and Abiud the father of Elakim, and Elakim the father of Azor, and Azor the father of Zadok, and Zadok the father of Akim, and Akim the father of Eluid, and Eluid the father of Eleazar, and Eleazar the father of Mathan, and Mathan the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who was called Messiah. So all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations. And from David to the deportation to Babylon, 14 generations. And from the deportation to Babylon to the Messiah, 14 generations. So we have three sets of 14 generations. And in that, those 5 women are listed by some name or other, not all of them by their actual names. One of them is just called the wife of Uriah, and we'll get to that in a minute. But these 5 women in Matthew's genealogy reveal stories of contrast between faithful outsiders and less faithful or even faithless insiders. The first 4 of those women are each from a different period of Israel's history, in addition to being women who were not of the tribe of Israel. Tamar was during the patriarchal period, that is the oldest and the pre-exile period, is her story. And Rahab, of course, was during the time when the promised land was finally acquired after the exile and the 40 years. And Ruth was in the period before the monarchs, during the time when Israel was ruled by judges, before they had their first king. And of course, Bathsheba, the fourth one, was during the glory days of Israel's monarchy, specifically during David and Solomon's reign. So let's note the contrast of these women, especially the first four. Tamar is determined to keep her own and her husband's family line going. And by contrast to that, her father-in-law, Judah, who is the patriarch of one of Israel's 12 tribes, is more concerned with the rest of his family and their personal well-being. And so he seems willing to throw his deceased son, the first one, and the son's widow, who is Tamar, under the bus and just leave them. And Tamar says, nope, that's not the way it's going to work. I'm going to use whatever I have to continue this family line. And she does. Rahab is a courageous, what I would call a double outsider, because number one, she lives in Jericho, so she's not an Israelite. But number two, by her profession, she would have been considered a serious outsider. And rather than caving in either to the leaders of Jericho, when they find out that spies have come and try to figure out where they are, because she's the one that hides them, or caving in to the wander-weary and the desperate Israelites, she negotiates for her own family's well-being in the process. Ruth demonstrates, not just with her words, but with her very life, a faithfulness to Naomi's family, and even to her mother-in-law, Naomi's God. And that stands in stark contrast to what was at best described as backstabbing and treachery that characterized a lot of Israel's so-called leaders toward the end of that period of the rule by judges, which I think is part of the reason that they were so anxious to have their first king. But why do you think Matthew identifies Bathsheba not by her own name, but by her husband's name, Uriah, the wife of Uriah? That was an interesting, she's the only one whose name is actually not mentioned in the genealogy, and yet we know exactly who she is. And the author of the study suggests that this was done to contrast Uriah's deep faithfulness to King David, because you remember when Uriah is called back after David finds out that Bathsheba's pregnant, David twice tries to get him to go to his house so they can blame this pregnancy on him, and he refuses because his men are in the field and he knows that's not what a battle leader is supposed to do, and he sleeps there in David's palace. And that part of what got him killed, because he didn't help David out there, didn't know what he was doing. So David's total disregard for both Uriah and Bathsheba's lives is a stark contrast between the faithfulness of Uriah. And the author of the study says maybe that's why Bathsheba was described as the wife of Uriah, so everybody would remember Uriah's faithfulness in contrast to David's. And then there's Mary, whose outsider status, in addition, of course, to being female, isn't really religious or cultural. After all, she is from around here, as we are wont to say. But her exclusion is moral, or at least so the culture thinks, because she is pregnant before marriage. So it's almost as if Matthew, by choosing to go against all of the tradition of patriarchy and to include these five females, is reminding us that no matter what period of human and national history in which males are acting and claiming control of and responsibility for what happens, these women are behind and beneath the glamorized highlights that would have made the news in the newspaper. And these women are the ones whose strength and whose courage and whose faithfulness have rowed the ship through one of the toughest storms in their lives, including a number of storms that were rather male induced. So maybe that rings true for your experience also, but that's why these 5 women are so significant in the genealogy. To be listed at all is one thing, but then to be the characters that they are, who are so strong and steadfast and faithful, that they're the ones that propel the story forward. Without them, some of those stories would have just trickled out the door and they would have had to start with somebody else. I don't think I've told you this story, which is rather humorous in some ways and not deadly serious, carrying the family tradition forward. But there was a Latin teacher at the high school in the church that I previously served, whose grandmother and whose mother were members of our church. He had been in Greenwood, Mississippi for many years and had come to live with his mother because she needed help. And so he got a job teaching at the high school, and he would come to church with her because that's where she wanted to come. And he told me one day his grandparents, he grew up in Greenwood, Mississippi, but his grandparents had some sort of like store mercantile downtown way back in the day when he was young, and he was considerably older than I was. And he told me, he said, did anybody ever tell you about how First Presbyterian got their stained glass windows? I said, no. He said, well, I can't remember the year. It was either the late 19 teens or the early 1920s. And First United Methodist Church in Fayetteville got stained glass windows. They were the first church in town to have stained glass windows. And then after they got the stained glass windows, there were folks in First Presbyterian Church, particularly among the women in the church, who said, well, we should have stained glass windows. If the Methodists have them, we can have them. Well, the session, either somebody brought it up to the session or the session refused to consider it. All men, of course, in the 1920s. Well, that was in the spring, I suppose, of that year. And it was the habit of the session not to meet during the summer because families took their vacations to the mountains to cool off. You know, this was prior to air conditioning, so it was hot in the flatlands over there, and they would go to the mountains for the summer. So no session meetings during the summer. Well, he told me, he said, this is what my grandmother told me. She said, during the summer of that year, the women of First Presbyterian Church did 2 things. They closed their kitchens and sent their cooks home for the summer. And then they closed their bedrooms. And he said at the first meeting in September, the session approved stained glass windows. So you never know. You do what you can.
What you got to work with.
Well,
There you
and the
go.
women raised the money for the windows too.
They probably did. They probably did. You're absolutely right. Okay, everybody should have a piece of cardstock in front of you. Jamie, you got some pens and pencils over there. If anybody needs something to write with, you can pass those around. You got one?
Oh, you need one?
No.
Oh.
Pass them around over here. Everybody got something to write with?
They all got something. I'm sorry.
No good.
Working on
Okay.
it. Been a while, probably not.
All right. Well, here's what I want you to do. I'm going to read a prayer that I have written basically about these 5 women that we've studied this year. And I want you to think about, as you are, this is not a prayer where you have to close your eyes because you got paper in front of you, you can make notes. Okay. This is a note-taking prayer. And what I want to do is I want you to think about these 5 women and think about at least one of them, if you can, maybe even more, that you would like to write a thank you note to for what they did and what they have taught you with the lesson of their lives. So if you want to make any notes, that's what your paper's for, to make notes on the thank you note that you would like to send. Okay? And this, sorry,
Is Phyllis getting up to get something?
I think she might be. We'll wait just a minute. She may have gone to get some paper, so we'll wait. But what we're going to do, I'll explain to you at the end, is that if at some point within the next week to 10 days, if you feel so inclined to actually write a thank you note and you'd like to share that with me, you know, write it on paper and hand it to me, and email it to me, text it, whatever. I will take the ones that are sent to me and compile them anonymously, thank you notes, and share them with the circle members. Now, if you don't feel like sharing yours because something is too personal, I understand. Keep it for yourself. Tuck it in your Bible, and maybe you can go back and look at it another time. But if you're interested in writing a thank you note, which is one of the things that's suggested in the lesson, I'll be glad to compile those and share those with everybody. Okay. All right. So here's the note prayer. Scripture is woven thick with tales of how those not from around here are most often the ones who recognize and understand God's showing up. There's Tamar, the unprotected victim of her brother-in-law's and then her father-in-law's fear and assumptions, which overrode their willingness to do the right thing by her according to levirate marriage laws. Then there's Rahab, the most marginalized of the marginalized, who lives in a hole in the wall on the edge of the city, making her vulnerable to foreign attack, and by her profession, vulnerable to undomestic abuse. She turned out to be a fly on the wall whose intelligence and strength equipped her to participate principally in Jericho's downfall, which put her in a position to join Israel's family by giving birth to Boaz himself, who be the good little boy in Ruth's story. Of course, there's Ruth, the Moabite outsider, whose unexpected and risky allegiance to and love for her widowed mother-in-law, Naomi, put her in a position to clearly demonstrate her fidelity, her tenacity, and her work ethic, which is what prompted Rahab's son Boaz to take Ruth as his wife, giving her the opportunity to become King David's great-grandmother. And we'll never be able to forget Bathsheba, the double-sided female in Matthew's genealogy, whose husband, Uriah the Hittite, one of David's military commanders,
Maybe West Palm is more.
Whose street address, hang on just a second.
He drove down through there and we did that road trip.
All right, Bathsheba. So she's double slided because she's not only in this story, but they don't even use her name. Whose husband was one of King David's military commanders, and whose street address, her home address, far too close to King David's palace and his wandering eye, put her in a position to be sexually abused by David and therefore to give birth to the eventual King Solomon. She played a crucial role in directing and mediating the de-escalation of the dysfunction and the sibling rivalry in David and Solomon's family. So she helped to negotiate some of those activities that could have gotten either one of them killed prematurely. And last but not least, there's Mary. Mary, quite contrary, or at least rebellious. The dream catcher and the courageous woman who dared to carry, give birth to, raise, and follow till the end and beyond the one who was God with skin on. These are among the myriad women who, both by gender and some by occupation and ethnicity, were people from the margins of society and beyond the edge. These are the ones who most easily recognize divine love, hope, and grace. They didn't have privilege, power, and influence. They didn't have possession to interfere with their vision. Instead, they were both open and vulnerable to the inbreaking of unconditional love and all its surprising fierceness. And here's the closing part of the prayer. Despite all the ways many of our sociocultural privileges grant us insider privilege and status, open us, we pray, O fountain of hope, to the expansiveness of your grace. These and all prayers we pray in the name of the one who was born into this genealogy of radical women, Jesus of Nazareth, who is the world's Redeemer. Yeah. So if you made any notes, or if you want to make some later, and decide that you would like to write a thank you note to one or more of those, I'll be glad to put those together and share those with everybody else if you'd like. Think about what these women, these grandmothers, as they're called, have taught you, or how their stories have encouraged you, or maybe even how you've seen yourself in some similar situations to theirs. So I'll let you, that's your homework. You can take that home with you if you want to. You'll pass the course whether you turn it back in or not. Don't worry. We'll move on to the next study in August. Despite the powerful culture of pre- and first century patriarchy, and despite the four Gospels' apparent male authorship, I mean, everybody assumes they were all written by males. And despite the early and even the modern church's predisposition toward keeping females toward the back of the bus, women have been inserting and weaving themselves in the story for the benefit of all since the dawn of creation. And this whole study is just a reminder of a few of those insignificant periods during Israel's life who have actually done that. So I'd like to just open it here for a minute and see if any of you have a story of your strong grandmothers in the faith, whether they are biological or just spiritual mothers or grandmothers, that you would like to share with the rest of the circle. Anybody?
I'll talk about my grandmama.
Okay.
As I said earlier, maybe y'all all weren't here, but I was born premature, and I was born in 1938, and we lived in Madison, Georgia. Well, it was just mother and daddy and me, and so when I was born, they called my grandmother, and she was out working in the garden, and she got dressed and came right away because the doctor said I would not live, and neither would mother. And so she got on the train and came with her garden shoes on. She forgot to change her shoes. But that blessed woman and her husband, my grandfather, lived with us till I was 8 years old. Mother and daddy both worked, and they gave up their entire life for me and my parents. And that's a powerful lesson. She was her daddy was a Presbyterian minister, so her faith was very strong. And she never wavered in any way as to what she believed or what she thought she should do or how she should act. It was just, there was no question. the way it's done.
Okay. Anybody else think of any stories you'd like to share?
I'm kind of reminded of the stories I've heard since I've been in Greenville about women wanting a new high school and leading the force to have Greenville's new high school 75 years ago. And starting that group called the Youth Builders and, being leaders in the process. And then also at this church, hearing about wanting to raise money to redo the Simon Room and how the women took that on. And when I heard the amount of money involved, I just thought, that's an extraordinary sacrifice for people to give their time in baking or whatever was involved to raise money and cooking and serving others. And so I think there's a Greenville tradition of women leading the way.
And, the other thing that happened when we were doing the Simon Room, once the older people in the church saw what we were doing, started getting checks, from elderly gentlemen, different ones, that to contribute to that because they thought, yes, these women are really out there working. So we got donations from the congregation just because we made the decision, or Presbyterian women made the decision to go forward with that.
And every window was a different size.
Oh, no, I didn't know that.
Oh, my.
It was a task.
Over at the hotel making those curtains.
Oh, yeah.
I remember.
Yeah.
I'd forgotten that.
Every window in the Simon Room?
No, in the hotel.
Hotel, we made
Curtains for the hotel. When they first
That
opened
was the
it.
hotel.
That was one
part
of
of
the
the
sheer
fundraising.
curtains. Yeah.
fundraisers.
Yeah, Bob Lodge was the manager over there at the time, and he knew we were looking for projects. I don't sew, but Val Wall and I took every pair of those over there and got on a ladder. And the little gentleman that just retired, the little black guy over there, he would bring us the ladder and he would assist us and would hang those things, and then we would pin them to where they should go, bring them back across the street, and the ladies would hem those things, and we'd take them back and hang them. So we hung every
How many
pair.
windows?
And they're still hanging.
They're still hanging. You can see
Wow.
them in the windows.
Wow.
But it's hard to work with that kind of fabric too,
Oh, yeah, it was.
because it's not easy.
Mhm. But we had a lot going on.
I guess we got our stained glass windows.
I feel fortunate that I knew a great grandmother and both of my maternal and paternal grandparents. So I feel very fortunate because I try to pattern myself with my grandchildren and great grandchildren. I try to pattern the things I learned from them. So
Okay. Anybody else?
This has nothing to do with my grandparents, but I will say, as a child growing up in this church, I have three women who stand out in my mind, and one is Mrs. Warner, one is Mrs. Smith, and one is Mrs. Reeves. And those three ladies taught Sunday school and gave us as good a foundation as we were listening to and behaving, but which we did behave then. There was, there wasn't an option. It wasn't. And then Mike and I left the church for a while and we came back. And Dot, you have been very, and I'll cry. To me.
the day Doc quit work was the best day of our lives.
I didn't know when I was
I
retired.
know. You took on your second job, which was harder than your other one. And no pay.
All right. Well, thank you all for sharing those stories. I want to end with a responsive reading, if you'll take one and pass it on. Take one and pass it on. They're marked so that some of you are reading the second part, some of you are reading the first part in the responsive. And I had this ready to go up on the screen, but because I didn't use the right button when I opened it, I can't do that either. So I will send it to Phyllis and Joyce so that they can see that, but you all can just listen to us share here. And I will start with you all who are reading first, so you, and just let you take it from there, okay? So everybody's got your marked part, all right? This is called Happen.
Yeah.
Ready?
These are the women who made history happen, not the women who were allowed to tell their version of history. Not the women who were given a choice about what history they were part of. These are the women who were faced with a harsh, binary world in which the choice was rise up and make it happen, or be forever buried underneath the rubble of the never happening. These are the women whose stories are told to remind us that we are women of this time and place.
Yeah.